I'm gonna do another quiz because I wanna go back a little bit in the history of Pride and talk about that with you. You see two bars here. On the left, the Black Cat in LA, and on the right, the Stonewall Inn. Does anyone know one of those two bars? Yeah? Stonewall. Who knows Stonewall, or who has heard of Stonewall? Who has heard about the Black Cat? Oh, yeah, well, at least one person here. That's really interesting because the first ever gay protest or like LGBTQ protest in the US took place at the Black Cat in LA in 1967. So that was a peaceful protest. We see one picture actually exists from this protest in 1967, and it protested the police violence against the people who frequented this bar. On the right hand, you see the only real picture ever existed from the Stonewall Inn riots in 1969, so 2 years later. However, what's really interesting is that we all, as a collective memory, have more Stonewall as like a point of memory. So that might have to do with the violence, but also with the media attention that got, because on the left-hand side, there was no media attention to peaceful protests. So this might also be one sign of why the protesters in those times shifted to more violent protests. Briefly for most of you who probably do know that, but Stonewall was in 1969 a bar in the Christopher Street in New York, and it was a very popular queer or gay bar, and it was raided by the police very frequently with a lot of violence, and there have been protests before, but the big riots were in June 1969. There is one, in one of the pictures, I think you can do like up there, that says something that has to do with the mafia. Has anyone an idea what the mafia has to do with queer liberation, with gay bars, or with New York City? Yes?
It said that the mafia owned the bar, the Stonewall bar.
Yes, the mafia owned the Stonewall bar. Why do you think, does it make sense for the mafia to own a bar for like gay bars in New York? Yeah?
It was easier for them to keep the police at bay.
Yes? Yeah?
Money laundering?
Also, very good point. I think that's always a good point with the mafia. Another idea?
The secrecy of being gay and the legal perspective around it makes it easier to be with those people who need to keep secrets, to do secret activities.
Yes, exactly. And also, like, of course, people who are in politics or in business and who go to those bars, who frequent those bars, they had pictures taken, so it's also like a way of making money with just like pressuring those people into being out. So the mafia actually had several gay bars all over the world, so it's really interesting if you look at those connections between organized crime and minorities. So Stonewall, that we already know so much about this, or as like a queer reference point, also has to do with this book, which was a very interesting and important book for the US context from the political science perspective, where we talked about this myth of Stonewall. And on the right, you can also see the memorial for the Stonewall riots, which I think is a very interesting choice for a memorial for violent riots. It's just those people talking, so I don't know who made this choice. But what about Europe? When do you think were the first gay, queer, or lesbian protests in the Netherlands recorded? 90s, 70s, 60s?
I just heard in another session, 67 was the first one, and Inholland.
Yes. That is true. But 67, yeah, it's right, it's a typo. So 67, because the interesting thing is also that the Netherlands, here again, were like with peaceful protests about the same time when the US happened, when all of that happened, but with the violence, they did not do that much here. Christopher Street Day is always used, or a lot of the time used as a synonym for Pride. Does anyone have an idea why that is? I kind of gave it away, so it's a little bit of a test how much you paid attention. Yeah.
It's the address of the Stonewall Inn.
Yes. It's the address of the Stonewall Inn, and also that's why it was chosen by the first organizers of the first ever Pride to be as inclusive as possible and not only have a gay pride, so it was just like the Christopher Street, so other people who went to this. I already brought two dates, like the first Pride in Berlin took place in 1979, and the first UK Pride took place in 1972, so the 1970s really is when the Pride started. But what are the issues, or what are like the themes that were protested and were talked about during Pride? So in the 1980s, it was very much about coming out of the closet, not being underground, being visible in society. I brought some pictures here. I don't know, does anyone recognize this gentleman? Yes.
Yes.
So just pay attention, he might come back on the slides later. So I think that was very much also what we see here, lesbian and gay pride here in the UK. So we see very much is just coming out of, in quotation, out of the shadows, but just being recognizable and visible in society. Also, we need research and not hysteria, very well connected to the AIDS epidemic that started here. AIDS also remained an issue right through the 90s. What we see in the 90s more and more is a diversification of also signs and protests. As an example, I brought you the New York bisexual woman. So we see a diversification in the protest movement, and we also see that there's a shift towards a more legal attitude. So protesting, for example, the Section 28, which is a law in the UK that is very discriminatory and criminalizes queer and LGBTQ people. So what we see from the 80s to the 90s is a shift from the society issues more to legal issues. If we go forward, yes?
Can we make the first now, or you prefer at the end?
Yeah, let's do the end. Perfect. So if we continue that and go into the 2000s, I brought you to three pictures from, once again, Ian McKellen. So he's a very prominent Pride figure in the UK, but also even more focus on same-sex marriage, on adoption. So even more this turn within the Pride movement to protest more legal elements. So what we really can see is this shift from society to more political legal aspect. Of course, it is only very simplified. I usually can do a whole semester about that, but for today, that's it. In the 2010s, then we see also a shift to more like a corporate side of Pride. We see what we did talk about last year about pink washing. So we see more and more companies here including and seeing that, oh, maybe trying to be diverse or just showing to be diverse is good for our business. So that is something that we really see, but also an increasing attention on trans issues is something that we really see during the time. So what do you think, who was the first company that ever did advertising for queer people or gay people?
Coca-Cola.
Coca-Cola?
Absolut Vodka.
Yes, Absolut Vodka. In 1981. And it's really interesting because it's a very nice ad they placed in a gay magazine, and it's coming out of the closet, so it's a double meaning for for coming out as homosexual, as trans, or whatever other sexual minority or gender identity, but also it's a little pun on the prohibition. So it's also this very interesting but also very good advertisement. And in the case of Absolut Vodka, for example, you see that a company that really supports the community also with funds from the 80s till now. So Coca-Cola, sorry, it doesn't really. So. Starbucks also doesn't anymore. So that's also really interesting that we see a shift that some countries, some companies in some countries really go away from supporting Pride. On the left you see Pride in Every Cup, a Starbucks commercial from a couple of years ago, but this year actually in the United States, Starbucks ordered their employees to take down rainbow flags because they don't want to polarize, they don't want to pay attention to that. We all know those arguments. So we see that's also just not a one-way street here.